Many talks that we attend these days, I'm sure you've had the same experience, talk quite a lot about big data and sort of data-intensive and data-centric research. And I'm going to do that for about one slide. Because my emphasis today is not just on the data-intensive, but there's much expertise in this room, not just in the data, but in the people. And if you like, this is about social-intensive or human-intensive research as well. And I'm going to give some examples of the new forms of scholarship that we're seeing occurring by choosing one particular domain, that of music or computational musicology. And towards the end of the talk, I will reflect a little on what this all means going forwards. For example, in the future of research communication, the future of scholarly communication. So that's the structure. I'm going to give you a lens as we go through to help explain some of these things. It's one you already have, but you might not have a name for it, and it's called social machines. So I shall also be introducing that topic quite early in the talk. Let's start with some big pictures. 10 years ago when, for example, in the UK we had 10 e-science centres set up around the country, we talked a lot about the data deluge, which was actually big data. We just called it the data deluge then. And we used to show pictures of the Large Hadron Collider and talk about the, wow, terabytes of data that were going to be produced. And now when you look at across a university and elsewhere, we see this big data phenomenon, this data deluge across all disciplines. And this picture captures it quite well because it's, without discussing quantities that make things big, we can think of big as when there's so much of it, you have to change the way you do things with it, when it requires some kind of methodological change. And we're seeing that turn occurring across multiple disciplines. I have the privilege in my multidisciplinary job of watching this in different ways across different disciplines and seeing how the capabilities in different communities evolve in the face of this. And I think one of my messages today is to demonstrate that humanities, far from being a follower in this, is actually setting the way forward, the trajectory that other disciplines could look to. Here's the slide with numbers on. So I could have chosen many digital library collections to have numbers about. I could have talked about the British Library Labs. I could have talked about digital Bodleian. I could have talked about one I saw interestingly recently, the Chinese CADL, Chinese Academic Digital Library, which also has some very large numbers. But if ever you've seen a presentation from the Harty Trust or Harty Trust Research Centre, they start with the slide with the numbers on. So I've used that one. And also those numbers are current off the website as of last night. And also they measure the content in terms of miles as well. So it just captures that scale here of the size of the collection, the scale of the collection, the scale of the corpus. But also to remember that for each of those where there are images associated with it, then there's quantities of data in that digitization as well. The picture on the right is the hyperspectral scanner that David Howell has in the Bodleian being used to capture data at so many different wavelengths. So our eyes are working with 3 detectors. This works with hundreds of detectors, big files, right? Bottom left, 2012, the Internet Archive celebrated that number of bytes. I'm not even going to try and work out what that number is. And then, just to make the point that it isn't just about digitization and it isn't about this ongoingly increasing archive like the Internet Archive, but the production of the content is something that's very large scale and very real time now. Now that picture on the bottom right is actually, I do recognize, is not a big data source. It's a vinyl reader. But it's comes from a project that we're working on with BBC and others, which is about capturing content sort of at source in the music studio. And yeah, look at the scale of content creation that's going on there. So these are all examples of scale, which is one of the words in the title. That kind of had a sort of humanities focus, but let me just talk a little bit about social science. Social science has embraced the opportunities of the new forms of data. That's the phrase that's being used. Think social media analytics, think Twitter, think Internet of Things. And this has been quite a significant turn. I talk about observing different turns across the different disciplines. So now we see recently a CDT call out from the Centre for Doctoral Training from ESRC in this area to build up capability in this area. And it's about analysing new social processes on the scale of the population in real time, which is a whole new opportunity in social science. So on the one hand, you can use new forms of data to do things that you were doing before in better or perhaps cheaper ways. Do we need a census? Can we use all the other sources of information? On the other hand, there are entirely new things in the digital world, title of talk, which warrant new analysis, new social processes, Twitter. And I'll give you some glimpses into this. But the point is that this is very much around the people as well as around the data. And that comes through very nicely in this picture, which some of you will have seen me use before, for which I apologize, but it's one of my big pictures, which is quite helpful for this talk. On the vertical axis, going from the traditional computing at the bottom to this world we're just discussing of big data, big computation, it's Moore's law. It's that tech axis which the electronics industry publishes the curves for, that tells us that in 3 years' time we will have this number of transistors on the chip, this number of cores in our processors, and so on. It's quite well understood, and it seems to be going on and on. The other axis is really important, and sometimes seems a little neglected. And it's the increasing participation of the humans, the society, in the digital world. Not just scholars, well, we'll be talking about scholars today, but citizens, not just in the Western world, but globally. So we're seeing a kind of big society thing, that's a bad phrase, a big people thing going on along the bottom as well as the big data at the top. And whilst not everything has to be in one of those quadrants, I think the really interesting space, and the one that I'm talking about today, is this top right quadrant. It's a complicated space. It's where people are interacting at scale with the digital world and generating data, but it's also where people are interacting with the digital world and analyzing data and using data. So that's where I'm going to focus. Adam mentioned that I direct the eResearch Centre in Oxford, and the trajectory of centres like that has been from the bottom left to the top left. It was that investment which many of you will remember in e-infrastructure. In the US, it was called cyber infrastructure. It's high-performance computing. It's supercomputing. It's important because it's the new value proposition of the computational capability. We can do things we couldn't do before. We can do things faster. Faster matters a lot in some disciplines when it's first past the post to discover a new drug, for example. We can do new things. But the shift in the last sort of 5 years has been really into this space where it's about the engagement of the citizens as well as about the technology. And if anyone wants to use this slide, they're very welcome. What you do is take the title of your talk and you put it in the top right quadrant. I guarantee it always works. So today I put digital scholarship there. On Friday I gave a talk at MIT and it says social machines. Another time you can put information society. You know, it's great. Be my guest. We can also discuss later what happens after this, because one school of thought says, well, this access going to more people is really going faster than anyone expected. It's quite unpredictable, and we really have to focus on that. And another says, oh, well, actually, we're going to run out of people at some point, but it carries on going up. And that hints at a kind of more automated future, which is something I'll come back to at the end of the talk, because it's something I think we really need to be thinking about as scholars, and particularly from a humanities viewpoint. Another big picture, which also, if you think about it, has data and people in it. So it's very easy to talk about open data. It's very easy to talk about big data. But what we've just seen in the previous slides is actually this is very much about people, and therefore it's about personal data as well. This is a slide from the Open Data Institute, because they find it necessary to deconflate those different terms. And we can also discuss later on what the question mark in the middle is, which is big, open, and personal data. So someone needs to come up with a good example of that for me. Here's another big picture. This is what I've observed walking around research institutions and glimpsing whiteboards, right? So over a period of time, in the last few years, this picture began to emerge. You'd have a cloudy thing on the left with lots of arrows coming out of it. And that could be the Large Hadron Collider, it could be Twitter, it could be digitization, you know. And then there's so much data and it's so fast that you can't deal with all of it. So you have to sample it somehow. You have some kind of detectors or sensors which are getting some subset of it. And you do some filtering in order to get what you want out of all the noise. And you store some of that and you work with the archive material as well. And you do some analytics. And eventually there's a human being, hurrah, who's the researcher or the analyst or the scholar on the right-hand side. And actually, you know, there are many of them, which is good. What's happening on these pictures, I observe, is that all those left to right arrows are now giving way also to some right to left arrows, because people are hitting limits on that pipeline. They run out of electricity, they run out of money, they run out of cooling. Something stops those big computers processing any more data coming in. And then you see the system becoming smarter. You see it's what the analysts actually want that's influencing what's actually collected. You see the systems learning from what the analysts are doing in order to better adapt that data processing pipeline, that analytical pipeline. You see their methods being shared amongst them, but also captured and automated. So this is the automation piece. And ultimately, of course, we were probably observing a system where people were interacting with the digital world and generating lots of data, like Twitter. So we have all sorts of people in this picture. We have the people who are the sources of the data. We have the people who are the analysts. And it's a closed system. It's not like pointing a telescope at the stars and seeing where they are, because when you point these telescopes into these socio-technical systems, they're influencing the behavior in the systems as well. It's a different, there are very few cases where it's like astronomy. So the thing about each of those pictures is they were social and they were technical. I'm not going to say so much about this today, but just to hint at this Internet of Things thing, which is something which is definitely in that top right quadrant. And we're seeing this enthusiasm at the moment and considerable government investment in the area of Internet of Things, which is companies promising to sell millions or billions of devices into our cars and our homes and our bodies. And it's a really interesting sort of moment of what feels like extreme technological determinism, where every company thinks it's going to sell all these devices and they're going to impact society, probably exponentially, that's normally the phrase. And they don't seem to be thinking about what will happen when they've succeeded and all those devices are out there and what happens when the devices are talking to each other, because it's not actually just about the things, it's about living in the Internet of Things, it's about the people. So this is a sort of provocation I gave in the digital economy talk a year ago, but I don't think it's any such thing as the Internet of Things. You can't assume closed systems which are separate to other systems, because actually people move between these systems. Everything's coupled. You can't assume that a benign world where everyone is going to do exactly what is assumed. It's a good thing that humans are created and subversive. We'll see increasing automation. We'll see machine-to-machine communication. So everything I've said about data sort of deluge gets far worse when it's machine-to-machine as well. We see automation in the behavior of these systems, in robotics, autonomous systems, drones. We see unforeseen assembly of things. What happens when you throw your devices away in the bin and they start interacting with each other? Are we looking at the whole life cycle? Who's responsible? Is anyone taking account of the risk of vulnerabilities? How do you control a system, if you need to, that is so completely devolved? So that's a set of concerns, but the point about them all is this is the human aspect coming in over the technology again. So over the last few years, we've seen many accounts of the change in scholarly practice, given this data-intensive world. This is a superbly titled paper by Doug Kell. Here is the evidence now. What's the hypothesis? The complementary roles of inductive and hypothesis-driven science in the post-genomic era. This is a world where, instead of the sort of alleged traditional method of design an experiment, collect the data, analyze it, we have all this data, now we come up with the hypothesis. And new results are occurring as an outcome of that approach. It's very, very clear. It's debatable whether that makes our previous methods entirely obsolete. Although Wired magazine did suggest that in 2007 with the end of theory, the data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. I should say I don't believe that. I see these new methods as new tools in our toolbox. A lot of discussion these days about big data, but also that philosophical or data fundamentalism argument about is it sufficient to have correlation? Do you have to understand causation? And some people claiming correlation is actually really useful because patterns help predict things in the future. And then in our sort of scholarly research world, Microsoft published this excellent book of essays called The Fourth Paradigm a few years ago now, Data-Intensive Scientific Discovery. I always get stuck at this point because I can never remember what paradigms 1, 2, and 3 were. And if we work in social science or humanities, we're pretty much used to starting with data, so I think that's actually the first paradigm, which is actually, I think Sheila Anderson for pointing that out to me. All of this, just to bring together that social and technical piece, is about knowledge infrastructure. Knowledge infrastructure is a great phrase. Knowledge infrastructure is this room. It's the British Library. It's a website. It's your institutions. It is the socio-technical system that is the infrastructure for the scholarship that we're conducting, and it's increasingly digital. It is not entirely digital. That's a good thing. This is a picture from a report that came out a couple of years ago from a workshop in Michigan. It captures excellently the fact that we are talking entirely about socio-technical systems here. given that, I'm going to give you this lens of social machines. I'm going to tell you what they are. What it's really about is empowering these citizens that we've just been describing. So one can always debate the definition of things. I'm sure you've seen many people debate the definition of digital humanities, for example, and I won't be doing that today. This is the original Tim Berners-Lee definition of social machines, and I think it's fine. So we're going to use this one. The quote that's normally used is the bit in green. Social machines on the web, processes in which the people do the creative work and the machine does the administration. It's an important principle because it's saying computers get on with what they're good at to enable humans to do what they're good at, rather than computers are replacing humans. And we can challenge and discuss that now. This is a 1999 quote, right? The bit that doesn't often get used, but I think is a better definition, is at the end of this paragraph. The ability to create new forms of social process would be given to the world at large and development would be rapid. Now, this is pre-Twitter, but actually Twitter's a fantastic example of that. It is those new social processes at the scale of the population, in real time, being developed rapidly. And you didn't have to fill out a form to register your hashtag and get it approved. You just do it, right? It is the empowered citizen. People are creating new social processes. And I won't go into this in great detail now, but obviously there's lots of interesting analysis and concern about this. If you think about the summer riots, the BlackBerry riots mediated by social media in London and other cities in this country, that's a good example of new social processes emerging at the scale of the population in real time mediated by social media. So these are very important things as a subject to study. They're also very important things as a source of data for study, and they're important tools we can use for study, and you may have experienced Twitter surveys, for example. So this is Tim, as ever, in 1999, had a really good insight into what was coming next. Here's an example of these new social processes, which I think captures quite a lot about social machines in sort of one slide. So many of you will remember the #NoMakeup selfie pics where people were uploading, tweeting on Twitter and Facebook pictures with no makeup, and probably showing the fact that they just donated to Cancer Research UK as well. Now, this started of a weekend with this picture. We welcome your #NoMakeup selfie. If you want to help beat cancer, then text beat to this number. Within a very short period of time, they had a couple of £1 million of donations. That was a very, very impressive, quotes, viral sort of campaign. But look at that original tweet. It says, "We're loving your cancer awareness, no makeup selfie pics. The campaign isn't ours, but every pound helps." Right. So this was someone else's social machine. This was, and I'm not sure, we're entirely sure whose it was, actually. Cancer Research UK jumped on the social machine, engaged with it with this picture. Interestingly, we talked about accidental assembly and Internet of Things. If you didn't type beat quite correctly and your predictive text converted it to bear, then instead you adopted a polar bear. Right? So that's an example of unforeseen interactions between social machines. Perhaps predictive text also is one. Nice example. Actually, Cancer Research UK is also a good example of citizen engagement in other ways. So this is the use of games, highly gamified citizen science apps in order to help beat cancer. So it's another example of new social processes, but involving citizens at scale in a scholarly process. Okay. And the social machines lens helps us look at these things. When we first talked about them 2 or 3 years ago, I used to use this slide. I haven't changed the slide, and that's an important point because it also demonstrates that social machines come and go. They have a life course. Some of them have disappeared, and some of them, there are many new ones we could add. I just want to focus, some of them have changed a lot, like reCAPTCHA on the top left. I just want to focus on a couple of these because the first, Wikipedia, is one that everyone's familiar with. And the second is citizen science in the form of Zooniverse. I'll tell you some stories about these two. Why is Wikipedia a social machine rather than just a Web2 social website where people upload content? Well, it's because they're new social processes, and those social processes have been defined by people. A demonstration of that, the fact that the behavior of the system is socially constituted rather than programmed in, is the fact that the behaviors are different in different countries, different legal jurisdictions, different cultures. The rules about redaction, for example. So it's quite a good example of new processes created, this kind of editorial hierarchy that occurs, and massive engagement of citizens, and it's an open platform. It's a wonderful one to study and to engage with. It's actually a source of quite a lot of discussion, and many of you have been involved in these, last year we had Wikimania events here in London that actually focused on social machines and had a look at Wikipedia from this perspective, because this is a MIT Technology Review quote saying the reason people aren't becoming sysops on Wikipedia is the loose collective running the site today is 90% male, operates a crushing bureaucracy with an often abrasive atmosphere. Well, having engaged with the community, I can confirm that A, that's true, but B, they know it's true and they're trying to fix it, so that's a good thing. So it shows that the life course of a social machine is something that's emergent. It's something that is a product of the society that's using it. Zooniverse started off as Galaxy Zoo, 165,000 people helping classify astronomical pictures of galaxies, spiral galaxies, because people are better at it at the moment than computers. Our cognitive apparatus is quite good at spotting those things. Computers might do it in a few years, but there's too much data for one research assistant. There are lots of citizens out there. So Galaxy Zoo was very successful, and the platform was refactored into Zooniverse, and every few weeks has produced new projects across many disciplines, including humanities and social science. And it's sort of a factory for social machines. Every one of these citizen science projects is its own little social machine. Some of them have had a rapid and successful run, like Serengeti, where motion detection cameras in the Serengeti were uploading pictures when they saw movement. And our job as citizens was to classify the animal. It turns out people really like doing that on the internet. So that was a very successful project. What's just happened, just a few months ago, excuse me, is another refactoring of that platform into something called Panoptes. Just skip over that, whoops. Which is the many-eyed monster. Now you can log into the Zooniverse and you can create your own citizen science project with some tooling that's provided, and the tooling is increasing in its sort of sophistication as time goes on. So this is really now, what is it? It's a social machine of social machine creation or something. So you can see the social machine lens applying here. This is citizen science, not crowdsourcing, because the citizens are really engaging with the science. We've had new discoveries, Greenpeace, Hannes Vorburg, papers in astrophysics with very large numbers of authors coming out because the citizens are engaging and having discussions amongst themselves and with the scientists. So there's a very interesting point there again about empowerment. So those are examples of social machines. We can use that lens a little bit going forward. And I just want to focus on one area of scholarship for a moment, which is music. Music information retrieval, computational musicology. We're not trying to replace musicologists here. Any musicologists in the audience will be pleased to know we're looking to support the process of musicology and doing outrageous things like analysing 1,000 pieces of music all at once instead of one at a time over a period of time. Now, musicology traditionally has involved looking at music manuscripts, but what we're doing now is working with recordings and performances. So actually there's a performance aspect to it as well. But it's a huge amount of data, and all the time people are recording concerts off the desk and uploading, for example, to the Internet Archive, to a live music archive there called eTree. So this is a stream of data coming in that we can analyse. But the reason this is a good example is that the problem we're solving here is fairly generic, and there's some kind of signal coming in, and we're trying to get to some understanding of that. We're very good at this as humans. So you listen to some music, and a piece of popular music, you may recognise the structure: intro, verse, bridge, verse, outro. Actually, doing that by computer is quite hard. That isn't just working out repetition, that's understanding the function of the different parts. That's tricky. If you're working bioinformatics, you'll recognise this as a challenge as well in terms of gene function. And what we were doing in the project called Salami, the second best project acronym ever, Structural Analysis of Large Amounts of Music Information, was to attempt that analysis at scale. And this is where I get trouble with the word scale, because people say, which scale was that? What we have is a need, an ambition to actually identify the structure of the music at quite a high level of resolution, if you like, but also that coarse AABA type structure. And this sort of visualization at the bottom captures the sort of thing we're looking for really well. The technique that's used by computer to do this is sequence alignment, and many of you may recognize this as it's used in other areas as well. So you take a piece of music and you basically slide it against itself and spot the times at which you have maximum correspondence, and that tells you whether repetition occurs. This is the thing that the top is cooking against this. I did this for a talk one Christmas and regretted that it turned out it has 17 bars, but anyway. And this is, the algorithm we use is also used in bioinformatics for gene sequence alignment. Okay, not an identical algorithm, but the approach, the method is very similar. And actually that same one again, exactly that same one, we've used some work by Mellon postdoc Glenn Roure a few years ago on intertextuality in French literature, for example. Actually, probably if you sat down with enough people for a very long period of time, you could have done this by hand, but really doing it with this algorithm enabled him to get results over a much larger corpus than we would have achieved any other way. It's a good demonstration of digital humanities and the affordances of digital. Same algorithm, different disciplines. But the reason this is social machines is that in the Salami project, we took the digital music collections in the Internet Archive and elsewhere, we student-sourced 1,000 pieces of music. So we got students in Canada and the UK to do the structural analysis of 1,000 pieces of music. We published that as linked data. And then we used that to inform the big crunch, the big run on supercomputers in Tennessee, to see if we could get the computers to do as well as the humans and to compare the results of that. Now, the thing on the left is clearly a social machine because we involve students in doing the analysis. This is what that looked like. Actually, we paid them, but that doesn't stop it being a social machine. The thing on the right, interestingly, is also a social machine. What happens every year, and it was last week in Malaga for this year, is the music information retrieval community come together with their algorithms trying to extract features from music, typically recorded music now, but some symbolic, and try to get their algorithms to go a few % better every year. But there's a democratic process by which they decide which features are going to be used in the competition. This was this year's features. And it is not a competition. I just used the word competition, but strictly it's not. It's an evaluation exchange. And of course, it doesn't at all look like a competition because they publish league tables. And there are many pages like this you'll find on the Merits wiki. Those happen to be the results from the structural analysis algorithms this year. But the interesting thing is this is a community who come together annually. They run their source code over a reference corpus in Illinois, which they don't have a copy of. It's non-consumptive research, but it's also necessary in terms of the tuning of the algorithms. And there's an infrastructure to run that competition. So we have a global infrastructure which runs code over music, a community that's generating structural analysis algorithms. And then we've got our reference corpus of 1,000 pieces of music, which is our ground truth, where we put quotes around ground and truth. So even though it kind of looked like old-fashioned e-science, you've got a load of data coming in and we're going to use a big computer, it's actually very much about social machines. It's about engaging people, scholars in the process at all stages. This is kind of how you can play with the results. I don't have time today to do a demo, but you can listen to the different structural analyses that have occurred from the different algorithms and from the people. And we have multiple interfaces to this, including being able to play what the algorithm has determined to be the same pieces of music, or same sections of music occurring at different times, playing them in each ear, and then you get to hear really whether they're the same or not. That was just one of very, very many music social machines, and many of you are probably engaged in them. This is one I quite like called Chordify, where you can give it a pointer to some audio, a URL to YouTube, or whatever your source of audio is. If it hasn't already done the analysis, in a few seconds, it works out the chord structure and presents it back to you. If you're a musician trying to cover a piece of music, this is incredibly useful. It's not perfect. The interesting step that's occurred recently is that Chordify enables you to edit the outcome. So now the crowd is improving the quality of the transcription. Now that's, if you think about it, interestingly different to what we saw with the astronomy. Because with astronomy, it's like lots of galaxies and statistically interesting to see who has, how many people have classified, who've done the data reduction and classify things in different ways. that's sort of one notion of truth that's being used in astronomy. Here, there is something people are moving towards. It's actually a kind of different notion of truth. And it's not well supported yet by the Zooniverse tools, but I think as the tools become more sophisticated and transcription is now possible, we'll see this being built into the system. So it will be easier to do this kind of social machine on a platform like Zooniverse. Interesting thing about the last couple of slides is they involved interfaces, and I wanted to make a point about this because it's very easy to get obsessed with data for the sake of data and the size of the data. We, I think, sometimes neglect the other important part of the socio-technical system, which is where the humans interface with it. Here's another notion of social addition. If the last piece is a kind of a social addition of a piece of music in terms of chord structure, this is some work on Shakespeare First Folio, where we're using PDF annotations to, in this case, have a sort of discussion around a print variant. This is interesting because whatever your devices are, you may well have PDF readers which let you do annotation. So rather than being on the web, this is sort of just on your device, which you can sit on the tube and use or whatever. And it's enabling the crowd to engage with the content. It's also focused on the materiality. This isn't just a piece of Shakespeare text that's been transcribed. This is absolutely about transcription of the materiality in TEI and annotation around that. And so we see lots of work going on, particularly in the linked data world, which underpins a lot of what I'm talking about, where we're doing something like here in this early music project called SlickMem, publishing a Sparkle endpoint, very important to think programmatically and to enable that automation in the research that we're discussing here, but equally providing the interfaces for people to do, in this case, ontology alignment in a dubiously named project called Slobber, which is semantic linking of BBC Radio. But again, interfaces. So just to emphasize that point, we, in Transforming Musicology project, captured a performance of Wagner's Ring Cycle in Birmingham a year ago now, where Carolyn here, Rinflesh, our musicologist, was capturing in real time her annotations on the score using a tablet. And this raises a whole set of interesting questions. We've built the interface for the work, but actually there is, again here, discussions to be had around the materiality, the situatedness, the fact that our musicologist was sitting there and experiencing the performance and capturing it. The fact that this is interesting because every performance is different, and that's why we want to do this annotation. And there's an interesting sort of line of work at the moment comparing that setup with, for example, a chemist in a chemistry lab with a lab notebook. Really then asking questions about automation, about whether you do this at a distance or whether you actually have to be there. So in another time we'll talk a lot more about the materiality. And a final interface one, just from a paper presented last Friday at the TEI conference. My colleague Ian Emsley has taken the notion of the Hinman collator, which some of you may know, which is an optomechanical device for comparing two pieces of printed text used, for example, on the Shakespeare First Folio, and giving you a stereoscopic effect where there are differences. He's sonified the TEI encoded text, plays it in both ears, so you get a stereoscopic effect when there are differences. So it's another use of sound. One can discuss the musicality of this one. So I've given you this lens of social machines. We've talked about looking at current shifts in scholarship through those. I want to mention something about studying social machines, and the reason is it makes the point that this isn't all about weblogs and big data and numbers. It's also about our methods that we can take from multiple disciplines, including humanities. And we could focus on one thing. We could focus on Wikipedia, we could focus on Facebook, we could focus on Twitter, and those are important, successful social machines. But there are many, many others, and the ones that fail are interesting too. And there are small ones and there are big ones, and they interact. And for all these reasons, the approach we've taken in studying social machines is to treat them as an ecosystem. And these things are out there, they're evolving as people develop them. People take ideas from one machine and apply them to another. So we're really sort of seeing different social machines evolving as time goes on. Recapture that we saw earlier has been used by other social machines to check whether people are humans or bots, and then that itself has changed. So lots of, the ecosystem looks something like this as time goes on. We see machines come and go, we see them fork, we see them get used for purposes other than that for which they were originally intended. And to observe that system, to study that system, we can take many different vantage points. You could look at one social machine You could look at, one observer could look at multiple social machines. All this amazing thing about social machines is they involve people, so you could talk to the people. And they were designed by people, so you can talk to those people as well. So there are all sorts of methods that we can use for observation, including building social machines to observe social machines. And over the last couple of years, we've been applying many of these methods, including the sort of the Web Observatory, which is a third-party observatory where you collect data and then you analyze it. So Twitter analytics very often follow this model. That's building a third-party thing. Another thing is to go into a social machine and insert probes, insert stethoscopes, if you like, to look at the health of the machine. And we've done that in Zooniverse by going in and capturing data in real time, social processes in real time. This is, the last two slides just demonstrate computer science slides, right? They have rectangles and they're normally 3 layers. Okay. Let me just show you another way of looking at this. The worry about a study of social machines is the emphasis can be on the machine. And it's talking about probes and sort of different disciplines. As different disciplines have encountered citizen science, you see different reactions. So the computer science reaction is, wow, we can program people, we can program the whole world, this is amazing, we have a giant global brain. And the social science response is, that's really interesting, we can study the process of citizen science. And some of the humanities response is, oh, we can use this to get citizens to transcribe stuff, which is something I'll respond to slightly in this talk. But actually what we're doing here, to emphasize the sociality, is to go back to that, like the Wikipedia slide earlier, where we talked about the story of Wikipedia and observed that social machines are often about stories. Facebook is deeply about stories. And sometimes we have stories about social machines. Sometimes stories are part of the engagement in the social machine. So, for example, Zooniverse, you're drawn into all the different projects by the stories about the projects. So we thought, let's look at it from a story perspective. We could talk about stories and social machines. And we took it a stage further. Colleagues Segalyn Tart and Pip Wilcox, who's in the room somewhere, said instead of saying social machines are like stories, what happens if we say social machines are stories? And we look at what we know from narratology about what makes a good story and see if that tells us what makes a good social machine. It turns out, in an initial experiment, it seems to work quite well. Zooniverse is highly storyified. Facebook, although it looks like it's all about stories, lacks many features that make it work in that sense. And Wikipedia, we've seen, assigns authority rights visually. So this took us into this world of stories and social machines, and we've now taken that a stage further by using a humanities method, prosopography. Which is a method that enables us to take biographies. In this case, they can be biographies of social machines, or in fact parts of social machines, or combinations of social machines. And then we have a systematic approach in order to analyze those stories of the machines and come up with some shared insights into the construction of social machines and their life course. So I really like that this is an example. In order to get the social into the social machines, what we're doing is using humanities scholarship. And there's a paper by Segalyn and others where we studied specific machines, moments in their lifetime, actually borrowing ideas from sort of archetypes. If you like, it's like a mythology, establishing a mythology of social machines. So I think a really nice example of humanities methods being applied to scholarship, into scholarship. My closing comments are to look ahead. It's kind of that top right quadrant and that arrow saying what happens next. I'll start by looking back. 350 years ago, we celebrated, this year we celebrated 350 years ago, the publication of the first open science journal in continuous publication, standing on the shoulders of giants, the philosophical transactions of the whole society. We ran the Future of Research Communication Conference in Oxford in January and took the opportunity to let our conference attendees, some of you were there, come down and have a look at a copy of Phil Tran's. In fact, it turned out we had multiple copies, and one was Christopher Wren's, which is the one here. And while we were in the room with 117 people, our Bodleian Special Collections colleagues produced a second copy and opened it up, and it was Edmund Halley's copy. At which point, the lecture room gasped. And I think there's a really interesting point there, where we talk about all this digital. However, it's because those people were in that room with that copy of the book used by that person that they gasped. Right? So this takes us back to the materiality piece. Over time, we have correspondence networks. Scholars communicating by sending written correspondence one way or another. We're studying those, possibly with a social machine. Now we're seeing scholarly publication evolving into, as we re-examine the future of libraries, future of publishing, we're seeing lots of disintermediation, new intermediaries appearing, lots of social machines, lots of websites. This is a set from a year ago by Richard O'Byrne from OUP. That picture would be very different today. Again, this is a very rapidly evolving, very vibrant, very vital ecosystem. And in many ways, talks like starting with big data imply that scholarship is about the big data elephant in the big data center. And really what I'm promoting here is a view which is a sense-making network. It was a sense-making network of scholars communicating with written correspondence. It's now a sense-making network of scholars and citizens communicating with expertise, their data, the software, models, narratives, all these different kinds of digital or digitally represented artifacts that we're exchanging within that network. And that's a compelling way of looking at this. And we're going to have lots of discussions about that network, what it looks like, what are the objects being exchanged. You can take an object view on this, you can take a kind of web view on this. But I want to say something about the affordances of digital within that network. So the first is that we can link up data to do things we couldn't do before. This is an example which is actually the other really good project title, Elephant, where we took the large corpus at the Hartley Trust in the US and the smaller EBO collection here, and got value from both things. So the EBO collection was is high quality metadata, but at the other end you've got a huge scale of data. The question is, if you bring these two things together with the linked data, can you ask questions that you couldn't ask before by bringing those two in combination? And here are the sort of questions that we were able to address in the Elephant project, which was a sort of prototype project and a work set creation program from Mellon, which we hope to take forward on a much wider scale. But the point is, it's the linking up of that data in that scholarly network. And that's done by tools, it's done by people, but it's done by automation, it's done by machines. So it's the digital, in that sense, making network. Here's the FAST project, which is about working with audio, as mentioned before, captured at source in a studio. So instead of an audio, a WAV file or an MP3 traveling from the studio right through the process of capture, production, consumption, and distribution, which is what's happening now, you capture a much richer object, much more reusable, a semantically richer object. And that pipeline is being challenged anyway because people are consuming and then producing directly from that content. So what you get then is much more ability to reuse, to remix the content. And although this is sort of firmly in the creative industry space, it's interesting to note that the music industry has kind of gone digital end-to-end, not quite into our brains yet, nearly to end, and with some pain figured out the business models and so on, in a way that science hasn't. I think we can learn something by looking at what's gone on in music and reflecting on that in science, and vice versa. So these objects that are being captured that go through to production and distribution and reuse are like the records of our experiments, of our research. They're like our papers. And there's a very rich world of exploration ahead of there, with very large amounts of data, with lots of semantics, and with lots of automation. This is the capture process. I hope that this is Mark DeVerno performing as we capture some music live at one of our advisory board meetings. I'm hoping that by the time you hear me present this again in a couple of years, I'll have pictures in each of those. I gave a talk at a Dagstall seminar a few years ago about sort of future research communication, and used this slide, and it's got this backdrop because it's a science fiction slide then, but my point now is that none of this is science fiction, this is all real. So I was talking about the increasing automation in our research infrastructure. On the whole, this is a good thing, but I want to raise some alarms as well. If you're a PhD student and you produce your thesis and you can put it on the shelf and it's a digital thesis and it has the software in there as well, imagine if a new data set comes along, you can just press a button, rerun your thesis, generate more papers. Okay. Seems quite a compelling idea, the executable document, the executable thesis. But absolutely, we can do that kind of thing. We have a website of scientific workflows, my experiment, where we can press a button to rerun a workflow over other data, or when the new data arrives, it just runs. And if new results come out, it can don't notify me. So we're seeing that already. There's decay. Things that work today might not work tomorrow. This is a world that changes a lot, but we're beginning to figure out how these things can automatically curate themselves, and they can repair themselves. If you produce new research automatically, whose IPR is it? And if something goes wrong as a result, who's responsible? Lots of questions around there. But this emphasizes that thing in the sense-making network, that the machines are users as well as the humans in that network. And we're increasingly thinking of that world. And then that takes us into my next actual seminar, which I'll be attending in January, which is about reproducible research. And I won't do my reproducibility rant now, but note the words reproducibility and rant both begin with R, as do all the words on this slide. The reproducible research community is doing something very important by emphasizing the need that the software that produces some results that when we run it today needs to produce the same results when we run it tomorrow or when someone else runs it. That's an important thing. I do not believe it's reproducibility. Reproducibility is when I'm in the lab and I've designed an experiment and I've run it and I've got a result and it's the result I was hoping for, but I have no idea whether that was for real. I want someone else to have a go and see if they get the same result, or whether it was just the position of the moon or something. And that's what we mean by the act of reproducing research. So in order to sort of challenge this reproducible research mantra that's been around now for a couple of years, this is my R-dimension slide, which basically is lots of other words beginning with R, which are really, really useful things to do, which is what the community is actually addressing. But reproducibility is one we need to discuss some more. If you were an audience of scientists and I said, do you believe in reproducibility, every hand would go up. If you're an audience of social scientists, no hands go up. And it's not because you don't believe in it, because you know it's actually quite a complicated thing. I haven't tested it with the humanities audience. So, and final automation, sort of slightly dystopian point is, this is a Gartner tool. This is for people in the digital marketing world who's trying to understand their way around the digital marketing world. I know you can't read this in detail. The point is it's complicated. This just reminds us about that ecosystem, that social machine, that set of social machines we're all engaged in, and we don't, in my view, seem to challenge enough, which is the online advertising world. The fact that you've just been looking on a hotel booking site and then you go to Facebook and, oh, that hotel you were just looking at has just been recommended to you as a sponsored link. That's interesting, isn't it? So what's going on behind the scenes if you watch how many websites are being accessed as you interact with the web is extraordinary. Your personal data is being auctioned and bartered, and there's all this stuff going on, and we seem to be accepting this. People are seeing different prices for things if they log in with a home address versus their work address, all sorts of things. So that's happening because of automation. It's happening because of, it takes us into an interesting space, the algorithms that have been deployed. Now, the defense of those algorithms is that those companies have a legal obligation to make as much money as possible for their shareholders. But the result is the behavior of those algorithms causes some things which look like discrimination, for example. So it raises this whole ethical algorithm issue. And I'm worried that our scholarly communication system might be heading that way. We might be burning in some of this kind of behavior. So, for example, looking at H indices, everything we're doing around bibliometrics, the more automation we have, the more we're going to see these effects there. A deeper concern is that as long as we capture our research methods and burn them into our knowledge infrastructure, we're kind of burning in an ontology, we're burning in our paradigm. And I'm not sure there's enough human challenge going on in order to take that forward. So in a Kuhnian sense, we really need to worry, I think, about whether there's a new science beginning to occur. I've suggested one today. Social machines is dealing with the anomaly of Wikipedia. But is it also actually going to restrict us? What's the role of the human in the loop? Where's the challenge? All sorts of concerns about automation. Taylorization, right? So I have talked about intersection of physical and digital. I've talked about the intersection of disciplines. I've talked about the intersection of the social and the technical. We've seen scale in the sense of quantities of data, and I suppose in the sense of music. We've seen social machines. This isn't a talk on digital humanities. This is a talk that is about scholarship in the digital world. It's about using digital methods in scholarship. It's also scholarship about the digital world. And my bold claim is that what we're doing in humanities, which I hope I've demonstrated, actually, we're really good at this. And other disciplines could look to humanities for a deep understanding of the human. That's the human in the humanities as we look at the humans in the digital world. So that's quite strong. And my message to the humanities community, or parts of it, well, I had a chance a few months ago to give a presentation at a Digital Humanities event in the States. And I wanted to address this sort of social machines thing that I keep seeing happening in humanities, where I think we can do better. And it's the thing I alluded to earlier, where people have a lot of data, they like it transcribed, so they think, we'll put this on the web, citizens will come and transcribe it, and it doesn't happen. And it's like, well, let's just think about this. Actually, I think we're really, really good at understanding humans and social machines. So let's use that lens. And the example I gave in Boston was to take, this actually is significantly a double-sided piece of paper. The bun on the right is the references. Concentrate on the two on the left. That, you can see, has got a 4-quadrant diagram on it, right? So this is me describing social machines. The second page is Pip Wilcox, who's in the room somewhere, who is an expert on the Bodleian First Folio, not just the First Folio of Shakespeare text, but the book, that actual book, the Bodleian First Folio, and its history, and how it was lost and found, and the crowdfunding that enabled it to be brought back, and the crowdfunding that enabled it to be digitized and transcribed. And if you relax that constraint of Tim Berners-Lee that social machines are, quotes, on the web, and you look at the entire history from the performance of a Shakespeare play and the capture of that through to the crowdfunding and the use of the book today, and the papers we write about it and putting them on SlideShare and academia.edu, you count the social machines, the annotations in the margin there, we come to about 18 social machines. That demonstrates that we've been doing social machines forever. Okay? And therefore, we should be able to come with quite a sophisticated view of using social machines in the process of scholarship. And that's my closing slide. That's what it's all about. The crowd is us. We are the citizens. Curate, cooperate, co-create, enjoy. Thank you.
So you say maybe science can learn something from the business models in music.
Yes.
But that was a bit of a throwaway line. I'm curious as to, what's behind that, sort of an interesting provocation.
I think evidence of some similar trends include the shift in music from people thinking very much about the album as the collection to downloading the individual tracks and building playlists. And we see a shift in scholarly publishing from the conference proceedings or the journal to the individual paper and so on. So you can see some obvious trends like that. I'm really interested in the, I suppose it's the consumers becoming the producers. I mean, we're absolutely seeing that in libraries, where we're seeing the libraries as a place where people used to go to access content, now being a place where you go to publish your research data and publish in your institutional repository. And that's the trend in music as well, where the affordance of digital is that you can sit in your bedroom and work in a digital studio, which you've taken out of your backpack. Essentially, it's your laptop and some other kit, which is way higher in quality than what's been used for many years in the industry. So it's, again, come around from the citizen empowerment. And I think maybe music's slightly ahead because people are empowered that much. Also, it's interesting because of the creativity aspect. I think it's a very important aspect of study, so we don't all become robots.
Do you think the importance of the original is going to go away? Or how will one know what the original is?
This is a great question. I don't know if I have an answer. I think that's a conversation we need to have. I've become very... I've learned an awful lot on this journey. I've watched a reaction in many audiences against a sort of an elitist reaction against the crowd engagement, a reaction against the notion that the crowd can create a definitive addition to something as opposed to the expert. But actually, the humble expert will recognise that there is no definitive version, and actually this is another way of getting to that truth. This is why I say we need a discussion about what we mean by truth. But I'm very, as you've noticed, compelled by the materiality. I don't want to create a silo of digital and say everything has to be digital, because this has been very much about celebrating the material as well. And sometimes digital gives us the ability to do completely new things, like juxtaposing digital representations of artifacts which we couldn't physically get together, and we can do amazing things with comparisons, and we've seen that with some of the examples here. But we are, I would believe that we should also celebrate the original. Important discussion to have.
I'm very pleased to hear that you used the word silo in the answer to your last question, because one of the criticisms Tim Berners-Lee made, of course, of many social media sites is that they function like closed silos. And
yes.
One of the biggest problems from a British library or from a curatorial perspective is the persistency of many of these platforms. And for example, if you look at Explore the British Library, the catalogue, there's an option to put notes and tags, and I sometimes point out typos in books I see in there. Now, the question I reasonably ask myself, and what any researcher will reasonably ask themselves, is how can they be sure that this information will still be available, say, in 5, 10 years, let alone the length of time which other published mediums have? And coming back to your point about this so-called snobbishness, what processes can digital scholars use to assure the quality of crowdsourced data?
So the best example, the example I'm closest to on this is actually in social science, where I've seen an enthusiastic embrace of Twitter analytics. It seems impossible to go to any event and not see a talk where people have analysed something on Twitter and they have a nice visualization. And when that started, that was important. But I thought the time will come when we start comparing that with existing methods and sort of calibrating ourselves and working out what's best and what's best practice. It's been very slow coming. And I think there's a Twitter silo and a Twitter analytics silo occurring. And the reason that ESRC program I mentioned earlier is called New Forms of Data rather than Social Media, or Social Media and Real-Time Analytics, which is the alternative title, was to avoid social media being a silo. And absolutely making the, because there will be other new forms of data. Internet of Things is a clear forthcoming source. So we're absolutely trying to work across the silos. And that's also why I deliberately don't get tied down in definitions of what do we mean by digital or digital humanities or social machines. Because I think that digital methods are just what we use in digital scholarship, and that occurs in many disciplines. The disciplines only exist for historical reasons. Why should they be the right ones going forward? So I'm a real silo buster. How do we deal with the elitism? Well, it's not happening as fast as I'd like. So social editions, which some of you will be aware, have been talked about for a while, Ray Seaman's work and so on. There aren't a huge collection out there for us to establish best practice yet. The Twitter analytics work and sort of the computational social science, where we can apply supercomputing, if you like, to some of those challenges to do new things. We could have done that 10 years ago, and it's still hard to find amazing examples of it happening. So I think the answer is through demonstration. People need to engage, as people engage and demonstrate what they're doing, that will cause this important conversation to occur. It seems to be slow. Initiatives like British Library Labs are exactly what we need in order to erase some of these challenges.